Hello and welcome to another 5-in-1 Mayaani Talks. I'm Mega of Mayaani Jewellery, and this beautiful space I welcome you to, especially if you're new, is a space in which we discuss jewelry from a conscious point of view. This is a space that I have created as I have become more consciously aware of the importance of us considering jewelry when it comes to luxury jewelry specifically, considering what we want that to look like and what meaning and values our luxury pieces of jewelry should actually hold. Now, across the last few videos that I've produced, you will notice that the theme generally at the moment is looking into glass seed bead artistry in India. So I've touched upon the heritage, the deep, rich heritage India has with glass seed bead artistry, how that originated, how various different parts of India have developed their own captivating and very distinct styles of beadwork, not just in terms of the beads they produce, but also the beadwork artistry itself. I have become familiar with Moti Bharat. I've been aware of Moti Bharat, which is specific to Gujarat in India, which is where I am ancestrally from. But I didn't know it was called Moti Bharat per se. But I've seen these Moti Bharat pieces growing up through childhood, and it's wonderful to now know what they're called for a start and the origins of them. But I've discussed that with you briefly. We've also touched upon the role of women artisans when it comes to preserving beadwork artistry traditions, the culture and heritage around beadwork embroidery across India. And now today, I thought we'd look at the role that a lot of Indian ateliers and artisans have when it comes to creating pieces of high fashion clothing, footwear, accessories for high fashion luxury design houses as well as luxury jewelry houses like Dior, Chanel, Gucci, Prada, to name a few. Now, of course, many of you may already be aware, going into fact number one, that a lot of these European high fashion luxury brands like Gucci, Dior, Prada, Chanel have for a long time been using Indian artisans and Indian ateliers to help them with the embroidery and the beadwork artistry behind the products that they're putting together, whether it's clothing, footwear, accessories. These Indian ateliers and artisans have been heavily involved, spending weeks and months piecing together putting on the glass seed bead work and the embroidery work required to actually, some would argue, bring the piece to life. Without that artistry, without that embroidery, without those beautiful, intricate, meticulous artisan touches, the expertly placed pieces of beads, bead glass, and expertly placed stitches, the garment itself or the product itself, whether it's clothing, shoes, or accessories, would essentially lose a lot of the beauty and the charm that it brings with it, and that wow factor that a lot of these design houses have in many of their garments and accessories and footwear that they produce. So these Indian ateliers and artisans typically come from all sorts of regions in India, Mumbai, Delhi, Kolkata, to name a few places. But whilst they are heavily involved in creating these pieces, when it comes to beadwork, artistry, and embroidery behind the pieces, they're not given proper credit for their involvement, and they're also often unnamed. Dior, for example, has been quite recognized quite widely for mislabeling their garments as Parisian couture, not necessarily correctly reflecting, by doing that, correctly reflecting the actual origins of the craftsmanship and the workmanship on these pieces, which is in oftentimes, often the case, Indian in origin, with Indian artisans and ateliers working for months and weeks to bring those Parisian pieces of couture to life. Of course, when it comes to these Indian ateliers and artisans, it's important to also recognize that the majority of them are women. And women still remain the primary bead workers and bead artists in a lot of parts of India, including Gujarat, where I'm from. They are still the primary bead artisans, specifically involved in the very delicate, intricate work that's very labor intensive, and they're not given the recognition in terms of being named or even necessarily fair pay, because of course through not being named they are paid, yes, but the amount that they're actually paid for their work can be massively devalued because they are not recognized, and people do not necessarily know that the origins of the beadwork artistry and embroidery on their pieces of couture fashion are actually Indian, and are actually these artisan women, for example. But as I say, it's not exclusively women, there are men involved too, but primarily a lot of them tend to be women. Fact number, going into Chanel as well. Sorry, before I move on, Chanel. I'm looking at my notes. Chanel and Lesage. Lesage, which is owned by Chanel, has is very famous for its embroidery, and a lot of this embroidery work that Lesage is famous for is actually done by Indian artisans who are trained in Lesage techniques. Now, Lesage is a technique of beadwork embroidery involving a hook, which was developed in France. However, India has developed prior to that, long before, had developed its own hook beadwork artistry technique called Ari, involving beadwork and thread. And Lesage relies heavily on Ari, for example. It also relies heavily on Zardozi, which is involving the metal thread work and beadwork, as well as glass seed bead surface embellishment as well. So Lesage has heavily relied upon those techniques which were specifically developed in India and not in Europe, without necessarily giving credit to those techniques and the origin specifically of those techniques. Fact number two, of course, with this, these high fashion, particularly European ateliers like Gucci, Prada, Dior, Chanel, employ thousands, hundreds of tens of thousands in some cases, thousands or tens of thousands of these Indian artisans to actually do the beadwork, embroidery, and embroidery behind their couture pieces. However, at the end of it all, only the brand label actually receives recognition for any of the work, which means essentially we have erased all the human voices and stories behind the artistry involved in creating that piece and bringing it to life, as well as erasing culture as well, because it's important to recognize and remember that what we think is true luxury today is actually a false idea of true luxury. True luxury does not work to hide away the origins of something. True luxury honors where something is from. The particular piece of luxury that we're talking about, it honors where it's from. And it also credits the voices behind that piece with no fear. It credits the stories, the human stories, and the narratives and the culture behind those pieces. So what we think is true luxury and what we've been sold as true luxury is, in my opinion, and there are, I'm sure many of you who would agree, is actually a false idea of luxury. Fact number three, of course, a lot of mislabeling has taken place in the fashion world when it comes to a lot of this beadwork artistry, but not just beadwork artistry, but a lot of designs that are rooted in Indian or African beadworking techniques have been generally just marked as or labeled as global fusion. We've also seen the incorrect use and labeling of a lot of these types of artistry as bohemian. Now, bohemian is a valid term when it comes to referring to pieces of art which have come from Bohemia. Bohemia, now largely Czech Republic. Is a specific region in Central Europe, which is now largely Czech Republic. And when things originate from there, it would be appropriate to call them Bohemian. Bohemia had a very big part to play when it came to laying down the foundations for glass seed bead production and manufacturing processes, which still continue to be behind the manufacture and production of glass seed beads today. However, where we have an issue is where in the 19th century across Europe, this term bohemian started to apply to artists, anything that was a bit homemade or exotic. It also started to be applied to anything that was not conventional, anything that went against the norm. So that was one moment in history when the term bohemian started to be used falsely or incorrectly. And then, of course, in the 20th century, bohemian started to be a term or label that was now used in Europe to refer to anything that was ethnic or tribal or even free spirited, for example. The problem with that term is that it essentially grouped together various different forms of artistry from various different cultural and traditional backgrounds into one melting pot. So essentially, Indian beadwork artistry, African beadwork traditions, Native American beadwork traditions and artistry were all basically put in this one melting pot called Bohemian, which essentially erased a whole lot of culture, a whole lot of heritage, and a whole lot of human stories and voices in the process. So this use of labeling, the misuse of labeling, is very important to recognize in the fashion world and in the fashion industry because it is responsible for essentially erasing a lot of the true history and disregarding the true history and origins of a lot of forms of artistry, not just beadwork, but beadwork included. Now, fact number four, of course, there is an increasing shift taking place, which is wonderful, increasing awareness of these errors that have been made, increasing attempts and efforts with campaigns like the Fashion Revolution working hard to restore recognition for the artisans that are behind the production of a lot of these particularly high fashion luxury jewelry and fashion brands. And not only pushing for those artisans to receive credit, but also pushing for them to receive fairer pay in the luxury supply chain, whether that's luxury jewelry, as mentioned, or luxury garments. Sorry, my camera's just moved there a bit, so now my head is chopped. I'll just duck lower. It's fine. So yes, so that's important to recognize that there is a shift taking place. But we as consumers, we as the people who invest in these luxury pieces of clothing, garments, clothing is garments, clothing, jewelry, accessories, footwear, we have a huge responsibility when it comes to ensuring that when we are investing in these luxury pieces, we are demanding more transparency when it comes to who is actually behind the making of this piece. What is the heritage, the history, the origins of this piece that I'm wearing, or the origin, the history of the artistry involved in creating what I'm wearing. And by doing that, we then force these high fashion luxury and jewelry houses to actually pay more attention to the people that are involved in creating the pieces that the brand ultimately receives recognition for at the moment with the label being attached. It actually needs to be a bit more transparent than that. We can't just attach a label to things anymore and claim them to be ours when actually there's a whole host of other people from different backgrounds involved in creating what we are claiming to be our production. Fact number five, of course, many independent artisans and brands like Mayaani Jewelry, yes, my brand, like Mayaani Jewelry, are redefining luxury by naming the maker, naming the person who has actually not just designed the pieces that you're investing in, but actually made the pieces that you're investing in. And if there's several different people involved in making it, then we're naming those people involved in making the piece that you're investing in. Honoring the craftsmanship in terms of not just the voices and the stories and the names of the people who are involved in making the actual piece that you've invested in, but honoring the story of that craftsmanship. Where did these skills and traditions come from? How far back do they go? How do they link culturally with the people who have used them to create what it is you're wearing today? And of course, by refusing anonymity as well, by making sure that we come into the spotlight, we make people aware that we are actually the people who are making these pieces that you're investing in, that are being potentially mislabeled and misrepresented. And then you're basically having a false idea of where this has actually come from. So I hope you enjoy these five facts. I want to move into our lovely question of today. All of these thoughts and facts have brought me or brought to mind a question for you. And I'd love to know what your luxury, whatever it is, whether it's luxury clothing, luxury jewelry, luxury footwear, luxury bags, whatever it is, what your luxury would look like if every pair of hands involved in bringing that piece of luxury to life was not only named, but was also celebrated. I would love to know what difference that would make to the piece of luxury that you are carrying now or you are wearing now. How would it be different? How would it feel different? How would it be treasured by you differently? How would you view it differently? And how would you appreciate it differently? How would you walk perhaps differently, even wearing it or carrying it, knowing that every pair of hands involved in creating it was not only named but also celebrated, so they received a fair pay for their work and for the work that was they contributed to actually bringing that piece to life. Of course, remembering that in the case of beadwork artistry, when it comes to India, many of those pairs of hands are the hands of women. So I would love to know what you think from today's 5-in-1 Mayaani Talks. And I'd love to know if you have any additional thoughts to share at all. I welcome them. If you enjoyed today's video, please hit the like button. It does help me more than you think it does. I know everyone says it, but it really does. So if you could hit that like button if you enjoyed. Of course, if you want to stick around, feel free to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you'll know when my next video is out. I produce one of these a week. I love coming on here and sharing my learning with you as I become more consciously aware, not only of the origins of beadwork, specifically glass seed beadwork, but also more consciously aware of why it is I have such a strong affinity for working with glass seed beads and why it is I believe so strongly that we need to together redefine the face of true luxury, of luxury jewelry, because at the moment, I believe the luxury that we have been sold is not true luxury. It's a false form of luxury based purely and primarily on the weight and the expensiveness of the materials involved in creating that piece of so-called luxury, where luxury, in my opinion, when it comes to true luxury, is actually about so much more than that. It's about the stories, the heritage, the meaning, the conversations behind the bringing to life of that piece, as well as the careful composition of that piece, from looking at the shapes, the colors, the sizes of the materials used, and sustainability as well. Sustainability is important. Sustainability is an integral part of true luxury, because true luxury does not seek to destroy things in the path of being created. It's actually seeks to support as much as possible whilst it is being created. That, in my opinion, is true luxury. So thank you for joining me. Remember, because your jewelry should always be more than just an afterthought. And I will be back again soon. It is UK here, UK weather, UK winter, so it is dark, which is why most of this video has been in the dark. But thank you for joining me. I'll be back again soon, and bye for now.